Today we'll be looking at Asch's experiment. It's one of the cornerstone experiments in the social influence chapter and very crucial for you to study. We'll be looking at the nitty-gritty of how the experiment was designed, what the outcomes were, and also what criticisms there were of the study. This will be wrapping up in a bigger picture of why experimentation is important in the first place. Why are we not just satisfied with our intuition about how the world works? Why do we need experimentation? So that knowledge should help you understand other experiments in the upcoming chapters and topics better, and thus also being able to answer questions better on an exam. So let's jump right into it. So Asch's conformity experiment is centered around one participant, depicted here in green, surrounded by something we call confederates. Confederates are actors that are collaborating with the experimenters, the researchers. So they're paid actors that are supposed to do something to have an effect on the participant. We'll go into the experiment in just a second, but first let's ask one simple question, which is, why do we need experiments in the first place? So there are certain statements, so we can believe certain statements because we can relate to them. Yeah, for example, we all conform sometimes, right? That makes sense. So sometimes we do conform to what other people say or do. We all know situations where we've done that, and we've all seen situations where people have done that, right? Some of us conform more or less than others. We know that some people like to follow rules, for example, more than others. So that also makes sense to us intuitively because we've experienced it firsthand. Third example, in some situations I will conform more than in others, right? So situation dependent. Maybe in one situation you feel more secure and therefore you will not do as others tell you, but you will stick to what you believe, right? So these make sense to us. But if we want to really validate whether these statements are true, even if we say, oh, why would you need to design an experiment to test if this is true? It makes total sense. Oftentimes our perception of the world and our understanding of how it works can be deceiving. So we can be wrong about what we believe. But on top of that, we can go even further. And through experimentation, we can find out even more things that we weren't sure about before with just our intuition. Okay? So for example, some of the questions we could answer with experimentation could be, does gender influence how much we conform? Is it maybe women that conform more or men that conform more, or are they both the same? To what extent can we change how much people conform, right? Is it possible to change people's conformity levels? Third one, does conformity depend on the situation? So are people more conform in certain situations than others? Interesting. Or person X is twice as conforming than person Y. Now, we could make these kind of statements if we could somehow measure conformity. How do we put conformity into numbers? How can we say maybe this person is twice as conform as somebody else? Yeah. So that's basically what Asch came up with. How do we measure conformity? So in summary, we need an experiment, some way of measuring conformity so that we can compare people and groups of people against each other, right? So put them in different situations and see what the changes are to their conformity. So let's drive into let's drive into it. Let's dive right into it. Let's start with a simple task. This participant is supposed to judge whether line A, B, or C is of the same length as that line X. Okay. So in this example, right, participant is given the question, which line has the same length as line X, and B is correct in this case, so the participant will be correct, right? So you give this task to each participant many times. So this participant maybe does it 50 times with different line lengths, and less than 1% gave the wrong answer, right? So if you give this task 100 times to the same person, the person is going to do one mistake, right? One mistake in 100 is 1%, okay? But what happens if we have confederates, so actors that give the wrong answer all the time, right? So the actors, before the experiment started, they talked to each other and agreed together they're all going to give the same wrong answer. Okay, so they might all say it's A. A is the same length as X. Now, what is the participant going to do? A, maybe? Are they going to be influenced, socially influenced by their peers, by the Confederates. The result is that 36.8% of the time, participants switched their answer to what they believed to something else, right? We know they believed it must have been B, because in the experiment without the Confederates, they all said B, right? Only 1% said something else. So in the large majority, they said B. But now when you introduce these Confederates, suddenly 36.8% of the time they say A, right? Very clear example of social influence. Wonderful. Let's look at how we would put this on a graph, and I'd like you to pause the video and do this yourself before I reveal the results. So the question is, how could you show these results on a bar chart? Okay, so the results are here. You can use them to make your bar chart. To remember to correctly label the X and Y axis and add a title as well. All right, here are the results. 3, 2, 1. We put on the Y-axis the percentage of false answers, right? We have 36.8 and 1%. So I put 1% here and 37, which is the closest to 36.8, closest whole number. And because this is percentages, I made the scale all the way up to 100, right? And these are two scales, so 1% is that distance, and from here to there is 36%, 37%. Great. And the bars then go to those heights we have with Confederates and without Confederates. So remember, when we have no Confederates, the participants only give the wrong answer in 1% of the time, and when there are Confederates, 36.8% of the time. Okay? Now the title must contain something that describes the X and Y axis, okay, and puts them in relation to each other. So we could say the percentage of false answers given by participants when Confederates were present versus not present, or there should be a T, not present, okay? So we're comparing these two against that. We're going to practice this from time to time, and I'd like you to try to do better. Eventually you should be able to describe or build these graphs yourself without mistakes. Let's move on. So now you can see that this difference here in these two bars, that is your social influence. I mean, isn't that cool? This is the value of experimentation. We can now show with numbers and even visually the influence of a social group, right? Without a social group, with a social group. And that is fascinating. Now we can mess with the system, right? What happens if we change the number of participants? What happens if we make the lines closer together so it gets harder to tell which line is the right one? Are they going to sway more? You see what I mean? So this is great. Now we can look at the different factors that can affect how much we are influenced by others. This is a summary slide of the Asch experiment. Before we move on, I wanted to point out two things. Firstly, the participants were 123 American male undergraduates. This is a major criticism of the experiment, which we'll get to in a minute. The second thing is that 25% of the participants never conformed to the Confederates in the study, which is incredible. It means that 25% of participants, which is roughly about 30 participants out of these 123, never conformed, never got swayed by or socially influenced by the Confederates in this study, which suggests that people differ quite significantly in how much they can be influenced by others. This is the original study. There are variations, which we'll get into now. So here is the first variation of the Asch experiment. We're going to change the difficulty of the task by changing the length of these lines. Now in this case, it's really hard to tell which one is the right answer because A and C are so close together, right? So what happens when the task difficulty increases? The result is that conformity increases, right? As participants were uncertain what the right answer was, they started relying on others. This is something we call ISI, or informational social influence. We're going to talk about that next. So this is the first variation out of 3. Let's look at the second one. If we look at group size, we can change the number of Confederates sitting around the table. And turns out that 3 Confederates caused participants to give 31.8% wrong answers, but more Confederates only increased that number by very little. So having 3 Confederates there at the table had a big effect, but after that, if you add more, 4, 5, 6, 7 Confederates, the increase in social influence that they can exert on the participant was less, was incremental, so very little, right? Maybe 32, 33, 34%, but not these big jumps, right? And that is very interesting, that there is an upper limit to the influence that a group can exert on somebody. Let's look at variation 3. In this example, one of the confederates is actually agreeing with the participant. So he basically agrees with whatever the confederate would like to say. So if the confederate says, you know what, I think it's answer A, and in this case it would be right, this one would also say it's A. Would that agreeableness, so having that confederate agree with the participant, would that affect the participant? And in fact, it does. So conformity decreases with a non-agreeing confederate. So it does help to have somebody on your side. That makes you more secure that your answer is actually the right one. Okay. This is the summary slide of the 3 variations of the experiment. You have task difficulty, group size, and unanimity. Okay, that's a difficult word. Unanimity means everybody agreeing with each other, right? But if you break that, like in this experiment here, if you break that, these guys are not agreeing together, but this one is breaking out. That's why this task variation is called unanimity. Okay. You can, again, copy this, paste this, put it in your folders. It's a good overview of the task variations in the Asch experiment. This is a pretty cool remake of the original Asch experiment by National Geographic. Link is in the video description below. I highly recommend that you check it out. It's also quite funny to watch how people react when they find out that they actually were participating in an experiment and were given the wrong answers. Let's look at some criticisms of Asch's experiment. The first one, which is also by far the biggest one, is that the experiment was only conducted with American men, so undergraduate students. And so the problem is that these results cannot be transferred to other groups within society or the world. So for example, what about women? Do women, if they were to do the same experiment, would they conform to the same degree or less or more? Would it also be 36% about? Or would it be 40% or 10%? Who knows? I mean, this is the thing, right? We cannot assume that women will behave in the same way. Same thing goes, even more interestingly here, I think, is that for other cultures that are known to be more conform, for example, in Asia, right? People are more likely to conform to the society. And I would, personally, I have the intuition, I would say that in Asian countries, people would conform more in the experiment. But maybe I'm wrong. I don't know. I cannot make that judgment because the experiment didn't look at differences between cultures. And so this is a big drawback of the experiment that you should definitely mention when asked about it, right? So these results can only be applied to American men. And you could even say young American men because they were all undergrad students in their early 20s, okay? Or even late teens. The second criticism of Asch experiment is that the experiment was extremely artificial, obviously, because it's in an experiment setting, right, in a laboratory, and the people there that participate in the experiment, they might not necessarily care very much about the experiment, right? Imagine you're sitting there and somebody's telling you to do something and you're like, well, whatever I do here, it doesn't really have any implications for my life. Like, why should I be very diligent about the answers that I give, right? And so when people care less, it impacts the results, and your results are not really showing what you're measuring. So when people do what the researcher wants them to do, we call that demand characteristics. We're going to come back to this again and again, and it's a big problem in experimentation that you have to consider, that people might be giving you answers you want to hear, rather than actually truthfully answering the question, okay? So because this is done in such an artificial environment and people might care less than they should, we can't generalize this to the real world situation. This means that we cannot assume that people will be behaving in the same way or will be influenced by others in the same way as we observed in the lab, okay? Better would be to make an experiment in the real world, where people assume that maybe they don't even know they're part of an experiment. Well, then it is more generalizable. But in this case, because it's in such artificial setting, you can't generalize it. But there's also some support. Other researchers have done similar experiments, like Lucas et al. In 2006, and they found the same thing, okay? And so they were giving participants math questions and found that people do also conform to what the other confederates were giving as answers, okay? The counterpoint is that it is a little bit more complicated than what Asch was originally saying about how this works. Okay, so it turns out that participants with a higher confidence in their math abilities conformed less than less confident participants. Okay, so if you are an absolute math genius, you will walk into this experiment and you will listen less to the Confederates. Also makes sense, right? And if you are very unsure about math, you're just going to basically copy whatever the answer is that the Confederate is giving, right? So apparently conformity also depends on individual factors like your confidence when it comes to math. Very interesting. So what this is saying, right, is that the social influence depends on something inside of the individual. So everybody is different. That's what Lucas et al. Said about as a criticism of Asch's experiment. They said basically, yes, it works, but it's more complicated than that. So that's it for today. If you'd like to download these slides, you can find them following the link in the video description below. If you are a teacher and you'd like to quiz your students on this content, you can sign up for free on ZenTeach and use our quizzing tool. Consider donating, following us on Twitter and YouTube, and definitely subscribe to get all the latest YouTube videos. The next lesson will be on obedience.